I'm here to talk today about starting an open source project and growing it to be very large. My name is Dan, and we'll get to about me in a second, but I'm here to talk about Appium. Who here knows what Appium is? A few of you. So I should probably start with that, but why is that not working? There we go. So my name is Dan Cuellar. I am the creator of the project Appium, which I'll tell you what it is. I currently head up software testing and front-end development at a company called Foodit in London. We build restaurant software. Previously, I was an engineering manager at Shazam and at a dating site called Zoosk. And way back in the day, I worked at Microsoft on Outlook and Excel and some other things you may know and love. And then way a long time ago, I went to school and got a computer science degree, but that was a long time ago. And I'm here to talk about Appium and tell the story of what happened with Appium. And I hope that you can take from it the learnings I've made. I find that the best way to learn is to do something stupid, suffer for it, and then never do it again. And so I'm hoping to save you all that frustration by just telling you about those stupid things I've done, and then you can go forth and learn without the suffering, hopefully. So before we talk about what Appium is, let's sort of talk about how it started. But this talk will be threefold. It will be tell you the stories of open source, and hopefully you can learn how to better contribute to, consume, etc. open source. It'll also be to explain to you what Appium is, and then hopefully I'll entertain you a little bit, maybe. So let's start with the beginning. And like most things, this is a case of necessity being the mother of invention. I think in the previous talk you heard earlier that open source starts with an itch. And so my itch was the most terrifying 5 words in software testing. Does anyone know what those words are? I always like to make people guess because they come up with funny things. Would anyone like to venture a guess as to what the most terrifying 5 words in testing are? No guesses. All right, well, it won't surprise anyone here to learn that these are the most terrifying 5 words in software testing. Some of you are laughing, but it's true. So just to give you a little background, for those of you who've been developers or software testers, there's mainly a developer crowd here as we're at a web developer conference. Those of you who've written anything for the App Store would understand that it has quite an arcane and annoying review process. Generally, it can take weeks to get changes rolled out. I hear in the last few months Apple's made it a little bit better. I haven't had to submit our app in a few months. But in general, you submit a patch, there's some sort of static analysis that Apple performs in their cloud on it. Then I think a human looks at it, one that appears not to be well trained in software development or anything like that, but just a human. I don't know who they are, what they get paid, why they do it. I've never met one of these people, but they review this thing, and then if they say it's okay, which sometimes they do, then you get to ship it, and more often than not, they have some inane question about something, and then it delays it another week. So the point of this all being that when you make a mistake on an iOS app, you're likely to suffer with that mistake for a long period of time, that being several weeks usually. Whereas in web development, which you guys know and love, if something's broken, it's usually quite quick to fix it. Once you identify the fix and develop the fix, you deploy the fix, and then barring some browser caching issues, people tend to get the fix quite promptly. It's not the case with an iOS application, unless it downloads everything from the internet. I have to qualify that. But in general, if you make a mistake in your iOS app, it lives in the store until people opt in to downloading an update after Apple has approved it through the review process. So once you get it through that process, it could still even be a few more weeks till all your users have migrated forward. This has gotten a bit better with the auto-update features in iOS and Android they added a few years ago. But in general, it's not the web. The code does not live on a server. It lives on a phone and in the App Store. And putting it there takes effort. So you don't want to make mistakes here. And it all sounded quite familiar to me. And it reminded me back of my days in a past life with things like this. Does anyone know what these are? Okay, good. People are laughing. I did a conference like a month ago, and I had to explain to like 50% of the crowd that software used to be printed on these things called CDs. They didn't understand. They're like, there was no app store? I don't get it. Where did it come from? So yes, for those of you who don't know, which seems to be very few people here, software used to come on physical media, be it a floppy disk, a 5¼ inch floppy disk, a 3½ inch less floppy disk, or CDs, or even DVDs, or zip drives, or who knows what. It came on all sorts of funny things. But what was bad about these was that once you printed it, it was printed, and you couldn't just print on top of it again. You know, yes, there are CD rewritables, but no one shipped software on a CD rewritable. Everyone shipped it on a read-only CD. So once you print it, you're stuck with the bug. And the iOS App Store review process reminds me quite a bit of this, wherein once you send it out there, you're going to have to live with it for a little bit. It's not as expensive as these. When we made a mistake on Excel or Outlook and we printed it to a CD, it cost millions of dollars to destroy all those CDs and reprint them. Fortunately, I was never part of anything like that, but there was always the stories you'd hear around the office of, oh, you remember Windows 98 when there was that stupid bug and we had to destroy all the disks and it cost the company $30 million to destroy 500 million CDs. So the testing process for this looked a bit different in that there were code freezes and multiple levels of review and several release candidates and betas. And I think most of you work in or startups or even enterprises are sort of moving to a more agile model now where you send something out, you get some feedback, based on the feedback you tweak it. You don't tend to plan products years in advance. You don't tend to have 6 months of features queued up like you would on these. And you don't have long periods of betas and code freezes and things like that like you'd see with this. So I got a new job at a dating site in San Francisco. It was my first experience with a mobile application. I had worked on the mobile application for Outlook, or not for Outlook, but for Office on iOS before it was released. And we hadn't actually done a release before I had left there, and I hadn't familiarized myself with the pain and suffering that was the mobile app world. And we had a mobile app in the App Store at this dating site, and it was actually generating quite a bit of money. And we would break it all the time because we had developers that came from the web agile background trying to apply that process to a medium, the App Store, which doesn't really accommodate it. And I was tasked as the head of testing to figure out how to solve this problem. And so I thought back and I thought, well, this is a startup. We don't make any money. Investors aren't going to wait, for code reviews and betas and release candidates. They don't care about that. We have nothing to lose, really. I mean, we can't break stuff, but we're not really protecting much either. It doesn't make sense because we can't compete with our competitors, especially in the dating site world, if we're taking months to do release candidates and betas and all that. So that's not an option here. But one other thing we had on Office was extensive automation from unit tests to integration tests to end-to-end tests. And there were unit testing frameworks in the iPhone, and we had been doing some of that, but we hardened that a bit. But I thought, why don't we do end-to-end tests, automated tests on the iPhone? And so I looked around at what was out there, and it was all shit. Like, it was all terrible. I won't go through each one of these, but just know that they're all terrible. They're not a viable solution to automate anything. Instruments, which is the one on the left, is the profiler for Xcode. And so it's designed to profile your app and find memory leaks and battery usage and functions that are expensive. It's a profiler. It's not a test automation tool. But Apple just thought it was cool to put this widget in there called UI Automation that would let you write JavaScript tests for your app that were static and you could run them, and they thought this was great. I don't know why they expected Objective-C developers to want to write JavaScript tests, but they did. And it was a terrible framework, and it was flaky, and no one used it. There's also Robotium, which I won't go into, but more of a step in the right direction, but Android only, and you had to compile it into your app, and a few other sort of downsides to it. And then lastly, there was PhoneMonkey, which I won't even dignify with anything. So what do we make to replace this, right? Well, I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could just do what we do on the web? So how many of you know what Selenium is? So now you know what Appium is, because they're the same thing. Appium is just an implementation of the Selenium protocol for mobile phones. So it lets you write Selenium tests for native and hybrid and web-based mobile applications. So whether it's a website you open in Safari or Chrome on a mobile phone, whether it's an app that contains web content, or whether it's a fully native app, Appium implements the Selenium protocol for all of those situations. So it extends something people already use and are familiar with and to one degree or another tolerate. I wouldn't say people like Selenium, but people generally accept that it is currently the best solution to automate the web. And it brings it to mobile. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? Like, we use this for web. It works reasonably well. We all have our frustrations with it, but it generally works. And so out of that comes the Appium philosophy. Well, what's wrong with everything else that's out there? So when I was looking at all these tools, what are some of the problems I saw, and what are the correct ways to do it? So one is to use standardized and sanctioned APIs and techniques. Many of the tools, especially the iOS ones, would tap into private APIs that Apple hadn't documented or encouraged or actually allowed people to use to automate the phone, which is effective in that you can get the job done, but is terrible in the sense that Apple makes no guarantee that these contracts that you're signing up for with these private APIs will continue to work in the future. They're private, so they're not meant for public consumption. And if you ever try to submit anything to the App Store that uses these, you're going to get rejected because they're private for a reason. And one of the few documented rules at the time in the App Store was don't use private APIs. They've since published a much longer, vaguer document that covers many things, but at the time that was one thing we knew was not acceptable. Secondly, most of the tools were written in the language that the developers of the project preferred and not targeted towards eventual consumers of their framework. So, like for example, the UI automation framework provided by Apple is written in JavaScript. All of their developers use Objective-C. Why would they want to use a different programming language? Why would they want to learn a programming language? How many of them would even know JavaScript or be proficient enough to write these tests? I mean, maybe they're proficient enough to write the tests, but nonetheless, it doesn't really make any sense. Or the tools like Frank and Kif and these other things, they were written in Ruby or things like that that just have nothing to do with anything related to mobile development. There aren't a lot of Ruby developers in mobile. You find a lot of Ruby developers in the web, but not really in the mobile space. Anyway, so we thought, wouldn't it be great if you could choose whatever you wanted? Thirdly, many of them required you to actually modify the source of your application, which anyone who knows shit about software testing will tell you that's a terrible idea. The moment you change the code, you're testing something entirely different. There's a line with debug builds and release builds where you can make some things to make it easier to debug, but you don't ship your debug build to your customers, and there's good reasons behind that. And so a lot of these things required you to inject all this stuff. So once you're running a full-blown HTTP server inside your application, it's going to profile a lot differently than an application that doesn't. When I worked at Shazam, our recording code was so sensitive when we recorded the music that anything could throw it off. So I can't imagine something taking HTTP requests in there. We would just get entirely different results. But just in principle, this is not part of your shipping application. Why should it be there? And then lastly, some of the tools were open source, but many of the better ones weren't. And I think the whole world is sort of coming around, even Microsoft you see with Linux running SQL Server and Ubuntu running in the Windows shell or whatever the hell's going on over there. Everyone's sort of coming around to the idea that open source sort of sets the technologies now. Private companies exist for other reasons, but proprietary technologies are headed out the door, and open source is coming in to be the choice of most people. And so this was 5 years ago when, I'm not going to say this was less obvious, but this was less widely accepted as the way to do things. But we always thought that Selenium is free to open source, and that's why it gains adoption. The moment you require people to pay to use something, you're going to cut the adoption of it. So we wanted it to be for everybody. So I'll go into quickly how it works. It's quite simple. I'll tell you the horrible way it was initially written. I won't tell you the beautiful way in which it's written now, because I find the horrible way is more fun to tell people. So it's just a server that sits there and runs and listens for requests from the Selenium protocol, and it translates those requests into either UI Automator 2 for Android, or depending on which implementation you're using, XCUI test, Objective-C calls, or JavaScript calls to UI Automation JS for iPhone, and then performs the action and then translates back a response for the Selenium client. So you connect to it using the client frameworks you already use for Selenium, you send it commands, it handles how to do them on mobile, and it spits it back. Some changes have been made to the Selenium protocol to accommodate things in mobile that don't exist on websites, such as gestures and like shaking the phone and things like that, or that are just newer to the web. So swiping exists in the web now, but it didn't at the time, and things like that have been added, or the protocol has been augmented to support this, but nonetheless, it's basically that simple. We just have an alternate implementation. You write tests the same way you always did. We'll handle doing it on a mobile phone. And how that ended up getting implemented on iOS initially was simply, we wrote a piece of JavaScript with a while true loop that sat there and waited for files to exist in a folder. So I should explain why I'm doing it like this. The idea is that the automation framework for iOS is heavily sandboxed, and they don't provide you a way to access the outside world. You're in JavaScript, but you're in a version of JavaScript that doesn't contain HTTP requests and all sorts of other useful things one might want to use. They left in two cool key things. They left in eval, which it comes in quite handy, and they also made a door into the outside world, and they let you run shell commands. So I think they figured people might want to like write a file or something from the test. So they give you the ability to run shell commands through this awkward framework they have. It's a function called UIA perform host task timeout argument, something like that. But anyways, it lets you run a shell command. And these are actually quite big holes. So eval lets you bring code into the system. And then I would say that perform host task argument timeouts lets you do whatever the hell you want on the host machine. So while they seem like little holes in the sandbox, they actually turned out to be quite significant and big enough to write a framework. So what our framework did is it sat there with a while true loop in JavaScript, it kept catting files in a folder in an order, so like 1.txt, waiting for it to exist. Then once nothing was written to standard error, we could tell that, and the status code was 0, we could tell that cat found the file. Cat's a shell command, we can use that. And then we would take the contents of the file and we'd run eval on it. And then we would write a file out using Python, which is one of my favorite shell commands, and save it sequentially ordered response file, so 1.resp.txt or whatever. And we wrote a client that would take Selenium commands, write the JavaScript version, dump it in a file, wait for the server to run it, read the output, and then spit it back to the client. So using that, we're able to take Apple's sandbox tool and pull it out of the sandbox. So now we're using it from any language we want using Selenium bindings. We wrote an implementation that writes files instead of sending HTTP requests. Eventually it's refactored to be proper, but anyway, it was kind of a neat hack. And so I'm going to come back to these, but I'll go to the next. So I come up with this thing, we start using it at my office, and it's great. The developer's like, oh, I can write tests now, and they're easy to write, and they're simple. And so I take the demo I have to the Selenium Conference as part of another talk I'm giving. I'm giving a talk on page object model stuff, writing well abstracted tests. And the tests I write, I'm showing them. I've written the tests in human readable language, and I've implemented all these methods for each platform. So we have an iOS platform, we have a web platform, etc. So you reuse the tests. That was the idea of the talk. But no one paid attention to my talk. Everyone was just like, how are you running tests on a mobile phone using Selenium? So at the end of the conference, I'm asked to give a lightning talk where you just get 5 minutes in front of the whole conference and you can say whatever you want. So I showed this off and everyone cheered and everyone's like, this is amazing, this is the next thing. And then I thought, oh great, finally someone's going to take this project and do something with it. And that's not what happened. So I got a couple emails from people saying, oh, this is cool, can I buy it? I think I got an offer of like $1,000, which is not a lot of money for, I guess, what Appium is now, but at the time it also didn't seem like a lot of money. But other than that, no one was really interested in it. And so I thought, wow, I really felt like the people in that room got what I was saying, and I thought they were interested, but maybe not. So nothing happened, and this was in April. And then finally around, let's say, late August, I got a phone call. I don't know how this guy got my phone number, but he gets my phone number. And he calls me, and it's Jason Huggins, who created Selenium. And he says, oh, I was at the Selenium Conference, and I saw your iOS stuff. Can you bring that over to this bar tonight? I wanted to show it to my developers and see what they can do with it. And I said, okay, cool. So I take my laptop over to this bar after work in San Francisco, and I show it to a few developers, and they kind of get what's going on, but it's written in .NET at the time, and I'll go into why that's a bad idea later. But they can't really figure out what to do with the source because they're all Python programmers and it's written in .NET. And so eventually I find the old version, I prototyped it out in Python, and I give them that. And they take it and they're like, oh, this is cool. And so we make a little project, and we have, I think, 3 contributors now. It's me, and it's Jason, and it's one of his people. And we go along, and we're sort of using it at my job. I don't know what they're doing with it, but it doesn't appear to be much. But they're contributing a thing every now and then. And then I get invited to speak at this other conference called the Mobile Testing Summit, which was in San Francisco. And Jason says, oh, we're bringing in all the people that are trying to solve the mobile automation problem, and we're going to put them all in a room and see what we come up with. And I said, oh, cool, that sounds like a great idea. It would be nice to finally have this solved for everybody. So I take it there, and it's kind of funny. At that point, we have to give it a name, because up until then, it was just sort of called iOS Automation or something like that. And so Jason and I are trying to think of a name, and we come up with the name Apple Cart. And like there's an idiom in English, don't upset the apple cart. And we thought, oh, this is kind of upsetting the apple cart, so wouldn't that be a clever name since it's iOS Automation, which is made by Apple Cart. So we call it Apple Cart, and we make the repo on GitHub, it's called Apple Cart. I think they print all the signs of the conference, it's called Apple Cart. And then I think the day before the conference, Jason calls me at like 8 in the morning. He's like, Dan, we can't call it Apple Cart. And I said, well, why not? He says, I was reading Apple's guidance on trademark defense and what they will legally defend and what they won't. And the prime example of something that they don't want you doing is calling something Apple Cart. It's actually the third example they give. And I said, oh. So anyways, we had to think of the name again. And Jason comes up with, oh, it's like Selenium for apps. So how about like Appium? And so thus it's now called Appium. So I go to the conference, and they announce me as the guy with Apple Cart, and I go up there and talk about something called Appium. I'm sort of towards the beginning of the conference, and then I go sit down, and everyone seems to think it's cool, but I see other cool stuff out there, and I'm like, oh, well, there's a lot of smart people here. But by the end of the conference, what they hadn't told me, what the guys over at Jason's company, which was Sauce Labs, had been doing was they had been putting Appium in their cloud. So at the end of the conference, they get up there, and the guy from Sauce Labs shows Appium running in the cloud, where you can run Selenium, put a remote HTTP address in, and start up a mobile phone in the cloud. And I'm like, okay, now this is really cool. I get why they're interested in it. So at that point, they renamed the project Appium, we start a foundation, there's a new GitHub repo, and things start to sort of move a bit now. Because every person who's trying to do mobile automation just saw this thing, and they've seen that, oh, Sauce Labs, one of the leaders in the automation space, has accepted this as their solution. They didn't tell me they had. I had no idea what they were going to demo at the end of this thing. And that's a theme you'll find out about open source. No one ever tells you anything, but I'll go into that later. So now that you know what Appium is and sort of how it started, I'll talk about how it grew and sort of some of the interesting things about this. 10 minutes. I'll talk fastly about what's going on. So for the first year of the project, we would answer literally any question people would ask on the forum in person. Most Stack Overflow questions. We would go to any conference that would have us. And I mean any. Like, not all of them are in nice places like this. I've been to very cold places in very bad hotel rooms that are very far away. And so I think I finally hit Hotels.com Gold this year, which is nice. But I spent a lot of time, maybe 30, 45 nights a year, at least, in hotel rooms, talking about this. And I've done that since the start of the project, just trying to get people interested. And that was quite important. Another thing that was important is the people at Sauce Labs put their social media person behind it, and they got a Twitter account, and they got a website up, and some things like that. And at one point, I remember we had about maybe 15 stars on GitHub, and someone in Japan, whose name I can't remember, retweeted something we said, and he had 200,000 followers. And all of a sudden, we went from 20 stars to 100 stars overnight. And we're like, how did this happen? And we searched Twitter, and we found out there was this guy in Japan. And so for like the next 6 months of the project, most of the forum questions were in Japanese, most of the tweets were in Japanese. It was quite weird. But eventually, I guess Japan was sort of an early adopter for it. But anyways, Twitter was quite important. And last, the most important thing I showed you was that philosophy. We've had that since day one. I'll credit Jason with coming up with it, but that's been important. Whenever we have an important decision to make, we go to the philosophy and see whether or not it fits. Another interesting thing about open source is that eventually it will take on a life of its own and you will lose control of it. So I have Frankenstein up there. But it's a good thing. So like I said, one day website and a Twitter account showed up. One day someone made a pull request to make Android work with it. I never intended for it to support Android. Didn't have that problem with Android. And Android, if you make a mistake, you can get it replaced in the App Store pretty quickly. At one point, the code was ported from Python to JavaScript. I was not happy about that, but it ended up being a good move in the long term. At one point, I even lost my commit bit on the Appium repo. I still don't know who did it or how it happened, but it's been restored. But that's quite weird. And I think the weirdest thing of all was I got a rejection letter from a conference I applied to talk to, and I just couldn't understand it because it was the perfect conference for me to talk about this at. And I'd done a few conferences at that point. I hadn't been rejected for a good one. Like, I've been rejected some I didn't belong at, but not like one like that. And I asked them, like, why? I don't understand. This really should be at your conference. You're wrong about this. And they say, oh, we've already accepted 2 other talks about Appium at our conference by other people. And I thought, wow, I'm the creator of this thing. Why? But they didn't know. I don't think I listed it in there because at the time, like, I didn't figure that was like a selling point. So anyways, I was like, this is a good thing. I was eventually talked into this being a good thing.
Sorry. I will borrow one of these.
Okay, so I have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I was eventually realized this was a good thing, and that if other people are talking about it, that means it's growing and people are adopting it. It's a good thing. But it takes, it's kind of, I really wanted to go wherever that conference was. I think it was in New York. I was like, I wanted a free trip to New York. Anyway, eventually you won't be able to answer all the questions. So Jonathan and I answered most of the questions for the first year, but then there started being like 100 questions a day. And even with me and Jonathan, that's several hours worth of work. And so the good thing is if you do it on a forum, people will read it, and then they will start chiming in if you're doing it well. And so eventually the community started taking that over from us. Eventually, I wasn't even able to read all the commits. We'd have 12 pull requests a day at one point. And like, I have a real job. I can't do that. I don't get paid to work on this. And so unit test your friend. Just say, oh, put some unit tests in there, and then the community will start reviewing it. It's all good. Eventually, you know what's going on anymore. So I don't know what Appium's up to this week. I have no idea. But I look at the release notes. I look at the pull requests. I look at the branches, and that's sort of how you have to figure it out eventually. But it scales quite differently than at a real company, I would say. Typically, there's someone dictating what's going on there. So this is the one slide that sort of summarizes everything I want to say up. The wrong way, don't use proprietary technologies. I originally wrote Appium in .NET. At the time, .NET was not an open source project like it is now, so no one wanted to contribute to it. When we moved to JavaScript, a much more widely accepted open platform, the contributions took off. Don't share code via email, put it on GitHub. When you send it to one person, only one person's getting it. When you put it on GitHub, everyone gets it and can contribute back. Don't provide no documentation. If it's a new project like Appium, people need to know how it works, and read the code is not an acceptable answer when the code is as big as ours is. If your project is 10 files, they can read the code. If your project is 2,000 files across 20 modules, they cannot read the code. Put your slides on the internet, that will be quite helpful. And always respond on forums. If people ask you in private communication, repost it to the forum and send them a link to the answer. That's always the best way to do it. Another interesting thing I found about open source was how you handle conflict. So at a big company, I don't think I would tell my employees, as someone who manages people for a living, to go yell at each other in the lunchroom to sort their problems out, and whoever finally gives in is the loser. But in open source, that's generally the way it works. Having these violent debates on the forums is quite good because people talk about the issues and they come to an understanding and your community gets behind the solution. Whereas if I just dictate the solution, no one understands why it came about and no one influences it. So it's always better to have everyone's input, and we try and do it that way. We try and keep it polite. But in general, it's quite different where at a company there's like a chain of command and someone eventually makes the decision. In open source, it's not that way at all. Sometimes whoever writes the code makes the answer. So sometimes if there's a debate, just make a pull request, and then amazingly some people decide, oh, that's not so bad. We can have that today, or we can keep talking. Don't really recommend this, but it's just a way to handle it. And lastly, like I said, the philosophy really helped with dealing with that sort of thing. So when peace is not an option, if you lose people, it's not the end of the world. Like as a manager, retention is one of the more important things you're evaluated on. If employees are leaving you, you're probably not a good manager. In an open source project, it just means that, okay, I have 5 minutes, that maybe that's not the direction this project's going to go in, and another project is going to do it. And so there have been other projects born sort of out of disagreement over Appium, and they've gone to contribute things that we've then taken back. They've taken things from us. It's beneficial. If I lose someone and they go work at Apple, I can't have their code anymore. In open source, it's not that way at all. Just because they've left doesn't mean. And also, competition is a good thing. Out of many projects doing the same thing, good things happen. So anyways, where are we now? By the numbers, 3,500 stars, 2,000 forks. We have, I think, 30,000 downloads a week on NPM. So I don't know how many users we have, but it's over 100,000, probably closer to 500,000 at this point. 150 contributors, 5,000 commits. That's an old number, 150,000 downloads of the 1.0, that was 2 years ago. So the 1.5, who knows? What's new in the new Appium? I'm going to skip this. Basically nothing. We just rewrote it because it was an open source project. It grew organically. And it was never designed to do half the stuff it does. So it's been completely rewritten now. It's going to be much more stable. And it's going to allow us to do things that we want to that are quite important. So Windows Phone and Windows Phone 10, Microsoft is actually contributing this, which is quite cool. Maybe not Windows Phone anymore since they killed it earlier in the week, but allegedly they're going to contribute it. But Windows 10, I've seen it. There's a beta I have. It works. It's coming soon. If not, there's some Russian guys that wrote a version that pretty much does the same thing. You can download that. I won't talk about it. We're going to write new GUIs. We're making iOS work with the new backend framework. It's already done. Apple just needs to make their framework work. I'm really running out of time. So I'll just go straight to the takeaway. Why did Appium succeed? From day one, there was a clear philosophy and vision. We always tried to be inclusive. We bootstrapped our tool on top of Selenium, an already accepted standard for how to do this. So that helps a lot. When you're trying to explain your project to someone and you can say it's the Selenium of this, or like it's the Shazam of that, or it's the Twitter of this, it's a lot easier. You notice most startup pitches like, oh, we're the Uber of breast milk or whatever. You know, like then people understand. I don't know what that is, but anyway, it helps. So we've always been inclusive. We support all these languages. We've been to many places. I've gone everywhere. Our website is translated into a dozen languages probably at this point. Windows and Mac, pretty much from day one, though I had to fight the people to get the Windows stuff in there. I didn't want it, but let's face it, 80% of the world is Windows. We should probably support it. And lastly, I have one personal takeaway from this, and this is the one thing I would like you to take away from this talk, is that I have the Steve Jobs quote, and I don't like Steve Jobs, but I like this quote, so I'm going to use it. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. You can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use, and once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. And what this quote means is that just because something's the way people have always done things, doesn't mean it's the best way to do things. So when you're out there, you're developers, and you see that everyone in the community is doing something wrong, that's a good time to start an open source project, and that's sort of how Appium was started. So don't assume that because this project is out there, that Facebook uses this, that Google uses this, that this is the correct way to do things. Often it's not. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whoever the leaders are, they have different problems to solve than most companies. You know, Microsoft has 1 billion customers. Facebook has 1 billion customers. That's going to require a very different solution than a dating site that has a couple 100,000 customers. They're entirely different problems. And also, just because they've done it doesn't mean there could be other reasons they've chosen the solution they have. There could be financial incentives. There could be dev managers that are draconian. There are a million reasons people choose the solutions they do, and it's not always because they're the best. So like I said, just because the people came out, there's an existing solution, look at it, analyze it, but it could totally be the wrong solution, and you might need to find something better. So I'm no smarter than you guys. I work at a company that delivers food to people. Before that, I worked at a dating site, hardly glamorous jobs. I don't send rockets into space that land on ships or whatever Elon Musk does for a living. So I'm no smarter than you guys, and I came up with this thing, and now a lot of people use it. So I encourage you all, if you have good ideas, go to conferences, share them with people, create open source projects, post on forums, contribute feedback to the community. Don't just be a taker, because your ideas are probably total crap. Most of mine are, but maybe you have a good one like I did, and you can have this cool, fun thing where you get to go to conferences and talk to people and travel the world for free and that kind of thing. And maybe you can help the industry solve an important problem like mobile automation. So, like I said, I'm not a genius. I came up with this thing. There's a lot of other shit things we have to do as software engineers that need good solutions, so please contribute them back. That would be my encouragement, because it's not as hard as you think, and a lot of people who've made the solutions that exist in our industry are no smarter than you. Except maybe Elon Musk, because he landed a rocket on a fucking battleship, and that's really cool. So anyways, if you want to know more, please follow me on Twitter. I feel like at some point in my life it'll be useful to have a lot of Twitter followers. I don't have any grudge or axe to grind at the moment, but at some point I would like to unleash an angry mob on somebody probably, or at least have that capability. So please follow me on Twitter. That's the Appium website. We have a Slack channel you can join. I'm around, ask me questions if you want to know. But basically, it's just Selenium for mobile. So if you know Selenium, write tests on your mobile websites using Safari or Chrome for mobile. Write tests on your mobile apps with it. I probably don't have time for questions. I'm probably done.
No, but they can find you.
I'll be around.
Right. Yeah, he will be around. Thank you very much.